So thanks very much indeed for being here. It is fantastic to see you all. I think I heard yesterday there was over 700 events, and so the fact that you've chosen this morning to come and spend some time with us and lean into this event, which you will do hopefully as we go through it, is very much appreciated. And so on behalf of the Green Finance Institute and Rabia Transitions, and with the support of the Laudes Foundation, I'd like to thank you for being here with us at London Climate Action Week. My name is James Hooton, and I lead our missions work here at the GFI. For those that don't know, the Green Finance Institute is a philanthropically funded global advisory firm that develops the solutions to crowding in private capital. For us, the financial system is a key lever, and is nowhere as more critical than when we think about the role of financing and delivering a just transition. We all know that transitions, particularly away from fossil fuels, are complex, disruptive and urgent. They touch on livelihoods, communities, social cohesion and geopolitical dynamics, as much as they do on investment returns or emissions targets. They need to be financed at scale and at pace, but they also need to be fair. In my opinion, these are two of the biggest challenges of our time. We have both to find the capital by creating the enabling conditions and risk-sharing mechanisms, and also shape that capital in ways that reflect the needs of where it is flowing to. Capital that works for both financiers and recipient countries, that supports not only new technologies, but new skills, industries, and opportunities for those whose lives and livelihoods are being impacted by the transition. In short, we need both quantity and quality of finance, as I've heard my colleague and friend Chantal say. Today's session takes that challenge head on. We are going to explore very practically why is investing in a just transition so difficult? Where do the sticking points arise? How do issues of project origination, deal structuring and sequencing come into play? And crucially, what might we do differently? So today, as hopefully you've appreciated, we are using an innovative format, certainly innovative from my perspective. The guys on the stage you'll see have a lot of lived experience in this, and I know there were people in the audience with lived experience, and so that's why we're keen for you to lean in. But from my perspective, this is a live mock negotiation, drawing on that real-world experience, will hopefully help us to surface the insights from the front lines of those deals, but as I say, your own experience too. But also, I really want to be clear up front, this is not about right and wrong, and it's not about left versus right or any of that. It's not about disparaging what has gone in the past. I certainly agree, and I know I've heard at the Green Finance Institute we talk about not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. So this is about building on what has gone before and improving it in ways that are replicable for future models and ways of doing business. And this is not ultimately, though, an academic exercise either. As this week has already shown, and as the Paris Agreement reminds us, transitions will only succeed if they are just. They will only attract the scale of finance needed if we can build approaches that are credible, investable, and equitable. And they will only deliver real-world impact if we collectively engineer solutions that work for all stakeholders. So thank you again for being here, and we really encourage you to lean in, participate actively, and help shape what we will be talking about today, and hopefully the foundations of a more practical and more just approach to financing the transition. So I'd like to invite my colleague and friend, Dr. Chantal Naidu.
Thank you, James. So, hi everyone, and welcome to this event. It's been long in the making. We've been talking for almost a year since London Climate Action Week last year, and I had the pleasure of being invited by the GFI and Laudes. So let me tell you a little bit about Rabia Transitions. It's a new non-profit think tank, although I don't really like using that word much, based in South Africa. And what we've been thinking through is the challenge of financing a transition in the sense of the context of all the disruption that it presents. And our imagining is how can the financial ecosystem support a just and dignified transition. So that's been the focus over the last 4 years. The way we've showed up is at 3 levels. The first one is building trusted relationships with financial actors in the ecosystem. And largely because if you sit quietly with financial actors, there's hardly ever a fully demonized situation in a financial actor situation. They just don't know sometimes how. They don't necessarily have the language of how they might contribute to the space. So our first angle has been to work with National Treasury and central banks, given that the two of them together can cause the most disruption in the financial ecosystem through regulation, through setting direction, and through policies and tools that can actually help activate action. The second level has been to try and drive a principles approach to finance. I've worked in the financial sector for a long time. I'm a reformed investment banker, although I still have PTSD from being an investment banker sometimes. But the appreciation that despite all of the frameworks that we have, and this has been since the 80s, right, we still have asking questions about, embedding social into financial deals and structures. And on a personal level, I find that very challenging. So the idea is that if you take a principles-based approach to finance, what would that look like in terms of how does justice show up, not just in construction and the actual impact, but also in the quality, as James mentioned, of the deals that we're putting together. And the third way in which we've been trying to show up is to support civil society groups that are working at community level. Often in developing country contexts, you're presented with policies and new ideas to comment on stakeholder engagement. You might have heard of this. We talk a lot about stakeholder engagement. But the idea is, how do we empower communities with knowledge so that they can actively engage in those consultations and they know what they are, what is on the table, what isn't on the table, and how to better engage in co-creating and owning their own journey. So that's been largely the part of our work. Justice is a deep part of that. Creating practical tools is a deep part of that. And through the 4 years of work, there's the level of frustration that is mounting for me is that, and I saw a little bit of it at last year's London Climate Action Week, is that we skim over, in some respects, what we think the problem is, and we try to jump towards the solution set, right? And I think sometimes we want to sit with what James said, just to emphasize that uncomfortable space where we're not trying to figure out the answer. We're just trying to figure out, do we both understand what each of us are saying and play with and fully appreciate what you can and can't do. And I think the essence of today was really about coming together in a very creative way to be able to have a conversation and blur the lines between us and them. And also understand the tensions that we feel within ourselves. We'll tell you later about our personal experiences of actually preparing for this. No blood was shed. But today's a really important moment, and we're so grateful that all of you have shown up. You could, as James said, there could have been so many other events you came to. Also, thank you to Laudes for their constant, quiet support, and then, very visible support in bringing everything together. So thanks, Claire, to you and your team for that, and to the GFI team from Rabia's side for also all of the logistics to make the event happen. So we hope you have fun. Definitely, please stay engaged. We've created little bits and tools for that, but Matt's going to tell you more about that. If I can introduce Matt Huxham, he's one of Rabia's senior technical advisors, but also probably well known to everybody that's worked in the climate space in London. So thank you.
Thanks, Chantal. So I'm going to invite you guys to lean in just a little bit, because what we're going to be doing over the next hour is a little bit of eavesdropping. We're going to present to you some moments, critical moments, from a fictionalized dialogue between a developing country and not a specific one, and a group of funders on my right-hand side, who are going to be trying to hammer out the technical detail of a just energy transition financing package. The only thing you need to know really is that this is a country that has strong fossil fuel dependence right now, right? So not everyone does. Before the characters will introduce themselves, just a little bit more background. So. This is not the first time that they've met each other. They've been negotiating for a few months. There was an initial ostensibly strong political declaration of support that was unfortunately leaked to the press before they could really get down to discussions, and that caused some initial tensions. But ultimately, they've worked together to agree what is the outline of a term sheet. And now what you're going to see is the moments when they move from that outline into something much more concrete that's actionable. So a few specifics for you. They've agreed that, roughly speaking, the financing requirement is around 20 billion US. Most of this is going to be made available in US dollars, with a little bit in euros as well. It's going to be dispersed over a period of around 10 years, and there's going to be a range of instruments still to be worked out, with tenors between 15 and 25 years. Who exactly is going to be providing the finance, and in what mixtures and under what terms, is still being hammered out. But there is an expectation that there's going to be a strong mix of public finance, some contribution of Global North private sector, potentially even some philanthropic money in there as well. So they're going to be two moments focused on what the parties are trying to arrange, and the second one, how they are trying to make this happen in reality. And there's a little bit of audience interaction too, which I'm sure everyone will be very excited about. But first, I will ask the characters to introduce themselves. So, the country delegation on my left.
Thank you. So, I'm in character now. Good morning. My name is Chantal. I'm a senior government official in a country negotiating financial support to transition towards a just and climate resilient development path. I work largely within the national treasury of my country. We raise capital for strategic initiatives, and we also liaise with multilateral development agencies for our annual capital raising and also the long-term national development needs. Our national efforts around climate recognize the need to balance development and the climate response, especially to minimize the disruption of our economy, which is presently, as Matt has highlighted, reliant on fossil fuels as a primary energy source. And at the same time, parts of our country are completely ravaged by climate effects. And that is also causing deep vulnerability on the critical infrastructure and the need to rebuild that infrastructure. They've increased in intensity, and their trajectory is not abating. It's getting worse. Our position on climate policies in our country is that it must be just, it must be dignified, and it must take account of our national development priorities. So, in addition, our position on financing both national sources and international sources is firstly that we need it, and secondly, it must be of a high quality and accessible in a manner that allows us to have a sustained transition over time. National government's role, as we see it, is to set strategic direction for the transition through our engagements domestically and internationally. We will also make available public capital for that purpose. And we recognize that the transition requires environmental, social, and economic trade-offs, as difficult as they are. But certain things are imperative, and they are also inevitable. So our focus is on inclusive, strategic, and pragmatic engagement with funders to allow for those long-term goals to be achieved. This is no easy task for us. We recognize the competing priorities. We recognize incumbent organizations that might be currently inconvenient in terms of fossil fuels support, but they have contributed to the economic fabric of the country historically. So there's a degree of compassion around those trade-offs that we need to make. But this is the nature of government, and above all, we're looking for partners to respect our sovereignty and appreciate the complexities we face in as much as we're trying to deliver this transition together. And on the together part, I'd like to introduce Armando, who is representing a group of funders. We've brought him into these negotiations because from a domestic perspective, we can't go alone, and we see us working closely together. Armando?
Thank you, Chantal. Good morning, everyone. My name is Armando. As Chantal mentioned, I'm part of the country delegation, but I represent a consortium of public and private financial institutions. Now, it's not often that the private sector gets invited to these types of negotiations. It's usually the case that we come after the fact, right? That we're told what the transition should look like rather than be co-creators in it. We believe the private sector is one of the pillars of our national economy, and therefore it's important that we're part of these conversations. We're very grateful to be here and be part of the conversation. Yes, private sector and public sector financial institutions work with our government to ensure that our priorities and our national strategies get enacted and get financed. And we might not always see eye to eye, but we have the same goal, which is we want our nation to thrive. We believe that a social transition is not just a moral imperative, it actually makes economic sense. It creates skilled workers, it makes the economy resilient. At the end of the day, private sector cares about one thing, and stability and a just transition is just good for business. My role here is to advise, to try and bridge the gap between public and private, to assure that capital is catalyzed from the private sector, that there's buy-in from the capital markets. We have a proven track record in our country. We're stable, we finance, and we're quite strong. We know that a whole of economy, a whole of society approach does not work if the private sector and the public financial institutions are not on board. We should not be just financiers, we should be co-creators. So with that, I'll thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to Matt.
Public and private sector singing from the same hymn sheet, at least initially. And over to the funder side.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Very privileged to be here and pleasure to see you all. My name is Penny. I represent a cohort of public sector sovereign interests, so in other words, a group of interests where we wish to contribute from public sources some support to a sovereign government for their just transition initiative. In that, it is important to note that it's a cohort of interests who each operate within their mandate and with respect to their priorities, their procedures, and also through certain intermediaries. So it's not a single entity; it's a number of entities from a public point of view. As Armando has alluded to, we are really seeking to use those public resources to catalyse the scale by introducing private sector and to lay down the fundamentals on how that could possibly be done in the context of policy and frameworks of the recipient country, where the recipient country is going to receive those funds. And I hope that this session will demystify even just a tiny piece of what a just transition engagement entails. Thank you.
Good morning, James. So I represent global asset managers. I represent the wall of private capital that is ready to be deployed, looking for risk-sharing mechanisms, looking to be crowded in appropriately, and ultimately looking for risk-adjusted returns. I am representing a group of, as I say, global asset managers that are very keen to diversify our portfolio and realise opportunities and work with and help this transition. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So just before we get stuck in, I'm reliably informed that this is not scripted, so these guys have not conferred with each other in advance, which means it may get messy, but that is probably also quite reflective of how things might work in practice. A little bit of housekeeping. So when you arrived, you will have been allocated to one of two groups, the country delegation and the funder delegation. If you're on the wrong side, please feel free to move now. On your seats, you'll have a piece of paper with a few different QR codes, right? If you're, depending on which side you're on, you'll have access to briefing materials relative to that side. And And you'll also have the background note, which is fit for you to take away. And importantly, at the bottom in the middle, the QR code for the Mentimeter. So we're going to be polling you a little bit. There'll be an opportunity for questions a little bit later on, but just a very brief technical test. If you can go into the Mentimeter, and anyone who's struggling, please let us know. The first question should say, which delegation are you part of? This is to see whether the caffeine is working this morning. So we'll give it a minute or so.
Just mention it's the bottom QR code in the middle?
Yes, the bottom QR code in the middle, which takes you to the page. And then one for you to think about as you're listening to the first act is the second question, which is some open reflections, I would say, on what you think makes investing in the just transition difficult. Okay, so as we are starting to have those things feeding in, and unusually we seem to have more power on the countryside rather than the funder side, I will leave the stage and pass the baton over to the countryside to start the first section. Thank you.
Penny and James, thank you so much for traveling so far. We really appreciate you coming to our country, and we are really grateful for all of the productive exchanges we've had online so far. So thank you so much for that. We trust we can move forward today with some of the more critical elements of the funding package that we've been discussing. And what I'm hoping for is, rather than a negotiation, we are able to have a collaboration around some kind of critical and an appreciation for the shared understanding of what we as a country require at this point in time, aiming towards a sustained transition and a sustained momentum more than anything else. So perhaps from my side, you have met Amanda online, so he's going to give a few opening remarks shortly. But if I can maybe just ask him to do that beforehand, and then what I'd like to do is just confirm the funding package as I understand it, just make sure you understand what our asks, and we can use that as a first way, because just to make sure we're on the same page with that one. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Chantal. Penny, James, it's glad to finally see you in person after so much back and forth. Just to echo what Chantal said, we're honored to have you here. But speaking for myself and the consortium that I represent, we truly are grateful to be part of these really important conversations. I don't think I'm overly optimistic when I say that we have the same goal. It's just a matter of finding the way to get there. I think we can deliver something that is shared benefits and based on mutual trust. From a personal point of view, from the private sector, we recognize your struggles, your mandates. I probably find that they're not so different from our own in the private sector in our country. So I think we'll be able to have a very open, frank conversation, one that reflects, like I said, ownership and enables finance to flow through the established financial institutions. We know the terrain, we've been doing the work. Now it's time to get it in action. That's it from me.
Yeah, great. Perhaps, Penny, James, if that's okay with you, I could just reiterate our asks and just my understanding of what you've put on the table so far. So we've agreed 20 billion as an aggregate amount. You have said you can provide this in terms of foreign currency, largely dollars, some euro. The availability factor, it has to be dispersed over 10 years. And the kind of tenure of all of what you're providing on the table is a 15 to 25 year type of tenure on, to the extent it might be loans. We've confirmed that the purpose of the funds is going to be around supporting low carbon transition, mainly in our energy and transport sectors. Secondly, to also build resilience to climate events, especially in the country's critical infrastructure. And third, which is actually the most important thing for us at this point as a country, is to ensure the just transition the justness element of any kind of investment and transition is embedded upfront in that. So our people, we need a people-centered approach to this. I think we still have to discuss our instruments, but I think our expectation that it's a combination of both development and private capital with some blending, international and public. That's why Armando is here to represent our interests. So also just to emphasize that we, often countries are criticized of where's your skin in the game, but we do have some, we've got some national money to put behind this and some local. But some of our prerequisites around all of that would be, given its energy, transport, and critical infrastructure around resilience, we really need to be able to have certainty across that funding period that this will flow. I think there's some obscurity of that at the moment. We need some ability to be able to front load and embed the just transition within every investment aspect. I think one thing that slightly is obscure to us is the extent to which we're looking at a very project-specific approach to this, as opposed to a system-wide approach. So if I can use banking terminology, the single asset funding for energy, then transport and critical, so we need something different to make that happen. And and these elements, I think in terms of what we need funded, we don't want a cherry picking. And let me express that in the sense that we know the transition is disruptive, as do you. We can appreciate that. We also know that funders only want certainty, whether you're international or national or public or private. There is a degree of certainty that you're looking for. But there's nothing certain about our world at the moment, and geopolitics shows us that. So with this increasingly volatile, from a national government perspective, creating social safety nets, catchments, and the social cohesion on a broader level, that will help us, get community, national, public buy-in to make this happen. So we are a little concerned that both the disruptive impacts and the opportunities need to be embedded in everything that you offer us in terms of origination strategies, particularly, and how that passes through. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and be nice to know if we've been obscure, if we need to elaborate further, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Chantal. In your remarks, you've highlighted that you wish to have a look at the intervention and the relationship on a holistic, systematic way, and looking to embed those just transition elements up front. I think in doing so, it might be a bit challenging, given that we're looking at a cohort of financiers with a cohort of private versus public sector financiers. And our mandates don't necessarily provide for the holistic position that you're having a look at. So I think what we'd like to, when you talk about the holistic position and the systemic position, it might be useful to engage on how you see the flow of funds working. So how those funds flow, who they're flowing to, and therefore what mechanisms are built around that fund flow in terms of who the recipient is, how those funds are going to be used, how they're going to be monitored, and what policy and regulatory frameworks underpin those. Those are the type of things that we'd be having to go back to our credit committees with, whether it's a public credit committee or a governance, to relate how that you see things happening, and whether the credit committees can actually accept, and whether the mandates and the structures of the various partners of the cohort are able to manage that. I think we really would like to impress upon you that fiscal prudence is really at the top of our list, to make sure that whatever funds flow, we're able to kind of assess those funds and understand how the funds might be serviced going forward. We'd also like to engage with you, knowing that your country has actually made some significant progress in some of the policy and regulatory issues, and to hear from you, how you're progressing and what the timelines look like. And I think that's why we've provided in this space that 10 years, so that we realize you're not quite at a level of building that foundation, still in the process, but significantly developed, how we might be able to disperse those funds over that time period. But I think for me critically, and for our cohort critically, it's an understanding of the flow of funds and how you intend to receive them and who's going to be taking some of the risks on those funds. But that we'll maybe discuss a bit later. Let's first have a look at the big flow of funds issue and what underpins that flow of funds. And perhaps I'd like to give James some opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think for me, around the what, and having had a conversation with our, the kind of a large group at our investment committee, we're keen to see those equities. Who are the project sponsors? Who are the local partners? Who's the lead implementer for this pipeline that we're talking about? And what clarity do we have on terms of that pipeline? Of course, we are talking 10 years here, and so seeing that pipeline over the course of that 10 years is going to be comforting for us to be able to understand the maturity of those, where they're at from a bankability perspective, and again, who those equity and project sponsors are, and not necessarily from a credit perspective, but also from a competency perspective in terms of being able to deliver on these projects in the size and scale that we're talking about here in terms of $20 billion. So just having that key piece, I think there's a red line to some extent, if I can use those words, around pre-PPA, so pre-power purchase agreements, in terms of where that funding comes from. I don't know if we've engaged philanthropy, GAP and the like, or I don't know if you've had conversations, Penny, on your side around some of the early stage risk that is going to be tricky for me to work through on our side. And maybe I'll just make one other point, if I can, from this, is around energy, transport and critical infrastructure, and a point has just been raised on our side around critical infrastructure and how that relates to the political will and ambition in the country. We've seen examples in the past around some of those projects being prioritised and then deprioritised, and so we're keen to understand the critical infrastructure piece and the political cycle piece, in terms of those challenges that we could face in terms of changing priorities.
Okay, thank you. Maybe if my first response could be, I know we're jumping into a lot of detail. First, in terms of flow of funds and all of that, what I'm struggling to understand is if you understand what we're saying by, what we mean by the systemic approach to what we need, because I think, with respect, you've both gone straight into what's the pipeline. But I think we are asking, because the pipeline is partly dependent on the funding, how you're going to bring the funding. It's a consortium of funders, so there's a series of parties that are involved, and all of them are already involved in our country in some way or the other. You've got lines into private banks, into some of the public banks, you've got your development assistance programs, so you are present in the country, so you're part of co-creating some of that. Obviously there's always a project, but I think what we're trying to develop through this package is how do we work together to make sure this collection of projects, some of which are on the ground already, how do we pull those together to make sure we can do the pipeline differently? That's part of the challenge. We'll get there with some of your other questions. James, you've asked very specific things, who are the sponsors, local partners, and all of that. I think it's either we've got the supply and we'll find the demand for funding, or we've got the demand for funding and we'll find the supply. Some of the challenges that even our government is asking, how are you going to make this funding available to us, right? We said it's in energy, transport, and some of that critical infrastructure. But I think what I'm struggling to understand, if you appreciate what we're asking for.
If I may also, look, no one understands better than the private sector that inertia to dip right into how, who, when, under what terms. But I think to Chantal's point, the question here is, what is it that we're financing? I'm not saying it's not important, let's get into that conversation, but let's be very clear on what is it that we're financing. And Penny, to your point on, it might fall outside of your mandate. Well, private sector does not have a development or social mandate, but we understand that we're not going to thrive, our business is not going to grow if society and communities don't grow along with us. So this is why we're kind of stepping into a more development position and working with government. And I hope you can join us there, because we need to think outside of our mandates. To Jane's point, I think bankability is important, but I would rephrase that as thinking long-term investments. Bankers understand long-term investment better than most people, right? So if we invest properly in society now, we will see those profits. So bankability is not a bad word, but we need to kind of switch the scope and not be limited by the tools and definitions that we already have, and say, okay, how do we finance this as a whole? But please.
Thank you for that. I'd just like to get back to you on your systemic and flow of funds. For us, the flow of funds is ultimately really important. It's really important to understand who, as I said before, so I'm afraid I'm repeating myself here, who is going to receive those funds. And when you've received those funds, how are they going to be dispersed? So if you're looking at a kind of a 20 billion flowing to a certain point, whoever's flowing, I think we're going to find that pretty difficult to accommodate, given the various mandates. And we can get into some of the detail on the how, but there are various mechanisms that our bilateral relationships have already established. So working over a three-year period, looking at your priorities and agreeing on what those priorities can possibly be. So we've got one group of that cohort. Then we have a different cohort within our partnership that have not necessarily engaged with your country before, but that could be for various reasons, but also based on some of the market dynamics and the regulatory and policy reform. That policy reform specifically, if we want to talk about an example in the energy sector, is to lay the groundwork to be able to further embed private sector and bring on that capital. That normally looks at a project-by-project basis. So now, if we're talking project by project, there's got to be a certain process, and as I said before, a certain governance. So I think we need to try and figure out who and how those funds, how those funds are going to flow. And in the private sector, new private sector kind of bilateral relationships, how one might facilitate, again, via the policy environment, the changes in policy. I believe that you kind of having a look at a change in your energy policy, for instance, your water policies. So it's quite a wide variety. But that really needs some certainty. So how do we embed that certainty so that the funds, once the funds have flowed, they are going to be used for the right purposes? That for us is really important. So I think we need to establish that really upfront, as opposed to when you're looking at systemic, providing it to as a one global amount, because governance doesn't work. We've got too many parties around the table on this side.
And maybe I could add, I don't want to contradict you, Penny, but I feel like you've talked about a portfolio approach to some extent, and I think we would welcome that. I think from my perspective, if we can see, like on the energy side, if we can align with your Department for Energy, on the transport side, if we can align with your Department for Transport on what plans they have and what projects they have, that is aligned to the national ambitions within transport or grid infrastructure, grid upgrades, how you're connecting renewables in, doing that as across the board is something that we could do. Just seeing, but again, we'd need to just see exactly who's underlying that piece, but doing it across. Matching up with your ambitions in energy and transport, I think that's something that we could do, depending again on where we are in terms of PPAs, etc.
Okay, maybe to your point, Penny, about flow of funds, right, and what we mean by the systemic angle. I think it's probably akin a little bit to what James is saying about typically the flow of funds. So to allay your fears, right, this is not all going into one big pot, and there's going to be one entity controlling flow of funds. I don't believe we're going to achieve a systemic effect in that way. What we need to do is and this is the role of government, right? We set the direction. We understand where the national players need to be. We understand where opportunities are going to come from. But this is already status quo in some ways. These things are already happening. They're happening on a single asset basis, right? As you rightly mentioned. I think what we're trying to make sure of is that those best empowered to deliver certain kinds of deals have access to that funding without any kind of, stopgaps in between. But I guess what to be able to achieve that effect partly depends on whether you appreciate what we're trying to do as far as the systemic portfolio angle, partly what James referred to, and Armando as well, in that what we see as our greatest risk is the stripping away of the people-centered approach in some of these deals and putting that to one side and saying government must take care of that. That's not private sector's problem. It's a debate that Armando and I, have been having for a long time also. Government's job is this, and your job and our job is this. But in this context, do we have the luxury in a transition context to be able to say, you guys do this, and we will only do this part? I think what we're looking for from a portfolio perspective is that, every deal that's done, every power plant that might be built, or every, alternative mode of transport actually has an opportunity that's linked into it directly as part of that project, let's say, where there's a justice component fit in, not as a CSI project, because some of the pipeline that's coming through that's being classified as justice components is happening out here in the sticks. And then you've got, renewables or other big investments happening on that side, which is totally decoupled from the communities and the impacts on the other side, right? Private sector knows how to make money. Armando knows very well how to make money, don't you? So from that perspective, deploying all of that and they would need access to it as well. So the flow of funds is not going to come directly to, into national treasuries, coffers, and then be dispersed out. But we're looking to plan with you if you buy into the principle of we're trying to have a portfolio, and from a portfolio perspective, to achieve a portfolio effect, you need some front loading of capital, and we know that you can put that on the table because of what we need to get funded, then we can better have the conversation about how does this funds have to flow so that our mutual, James used the word red lines, are achieved, right? National government has no intention of trying to control every single cent, but we would like line of sight of how it is spent as well nationally, because you're putting a few, sweets on the table in terms of concessionality, in terms of grants, I imagine, that's in your package, and we want to make sure that that's used to best effect.
Right, so we're going to give our participants a little break right now. How are you guys feeling about how things are going? If I can ask you to come back to the Mentimeter, you should be able to give us 1 of 5 impressions. So perhaps you think it's constructive, maybe even respectful. Perhaps you're still on the fence and say it's neutral. It may also be hostile or dismissive. Okay. And for those of you who are quick on the technology, you could move to the second question at this point, which is, and this is where we'd like to, give you the opportunity to write a bit more openly. What is your understanding right now of what the country over here is asking for? And I'm going to ask 1 or 2 of you to voice that a little bit. But where are we at? Okay. So currently, respectful seems to be the winner. It'd be interesting to see whether that remains the same. And it's interesting because, I can certainly see that even though there are some kind of structural differences opening up, clearly there is a sense of, at least at a high level, an intent to get to an outcome that works for all. There also seems to be some potential around the portfolio approach, right? And that comes through in at least one of the original responses. Does anyone in the room like to give a perspective at this point? No, it's early on, but anyone from the countryside would like to? Please go ahead. We'll have a mic coming to you from the back.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. From Adi from Ministry of Finance Indonesia. I really enjoyed the constructive discussion. Yeah. But I would like to emphasize on if we trying to ask on the country specific needs in mobilizing funding. The most difficult one for us is actually trying to find the feasible and bankable project. That's actually the things. And when we find it, the second point that we need to also support is on how to scaling up. So with these two, I think the preliminary discussions already laid down that specific intention. So I would like to then explore if in that sense, the country, what we can do further if we have difficulties on that matters. I think that's actually the one that we would like to further know about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think what you're saying is that one of the, almost the prerequisites from the funder side for the country is actually one of the things that you might find the most difficult in your experience. How about from the funder side? Anyone has a comment? So in the back.
Just a couple of things. So I thought that. So just an immediate reflection. I think it seems to be going quite well. I'm wondering why we shot down the idea of setting up an entity to deal with some of these issues, because it felt a little bit to me like once we conclude this initial sort of meeting, we have a high-level agreement, we can get into the details of exactly how funds are dispersed in that sort of structure, with both sides feeding in and representation and things like that. So to me, that felt like a useful avenue maybe to explore a bit further. The other thing, just more generally from a WBA perspective, something that we think really, really important when thinking about integrated just transition and thinking about climate and nature is supply chains. So we think that that is really where a lot of the emphasis on putting people into the just transition is really focused on. So it's not so much a sort of question, but sort of a prompt that it would be great to see how participants in the discussion are thinking about the role of supply chains here and the just transition there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Just a few from the system. I'm not sure whether there's any online in the chat. I think, I mean, that there are quite a few of you who are referencing the numbers that we mentioned at the beginning. One person has is being a little open in saying that they still feel like that the countryside needs to do more to explain what a systemic approach really means, and also what people-centered means, but without much in the way of detail. And I think maybe finally one thing that's common across the piece is this question about who has discretion and at what point around what the funds are being spent on and over the governance. So there's a bit of a mix. Most people sticking with the hard facts, which suggests to me like the country does have a little bit more work to do in the rest of the negotiations. Anybody else that would like to stick their hand up in the room? Please go ahead.
I do think, just to that point, I do think it's quite important. I understand why the countryside is frustrated by the apparent rush to granularity of the funding side. But from the funding point of view, it is quite important quite soon to get to a point of understanding where within this 20 billion package, how much of that is potentially, as it were, revenue generating, and how much of it is not revenue generating, but is an important part of the package for other.
Okay, so it's
because you said, just to be clear, because you said this is a country which has substantial fossil fuel.
Correct. Yeah.
Something like that. So quite a lot of the cost of this is going to be the cost of transitioning out of that, which is not necessarily itself revenue generating. But I'm assuming that's all part of this 20 billion.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So and time, I think, for one more at the back.
I could also just, if you can all hear me that side. Maybe I've been swept up in the role play, but I would just advocate for the just transition in even the power element of this conversation. Why should the country rush so quickly to have to defend a systems approach, given it is a country in dire need, stressed that parts of it are facing mass exposure to climate change? Shouldn't it need a systems approach, or at least be allowed for a little longer in the discussions to hold on to that kind of masthead?
Okay, thank you. So for those on the line who will be hearing it through the mic, so we do have I can do it. It's fine because we need to move on. But ultimately we have a difference in the room between the country perspective, which and the focus on justice, which seems to demand a systemic approach from this gentleman's perspective, but also really a close look at the practicalities cannot be avoided in the short run. Otherwise, the funder side runs the risk of, I guess, wasting time and patience on the part of credit committees and governance. Okay, so for now we're gonna halt the discussion and move back to our participants. I'm going to ask you to, for a second, believe that we have got through some of these challenges around the questions of what is being financed, and now move on to the next section, more focused around the structure, and I'm going to pass over to the funders.
Chantal and Armando, thank you for the progress we've made so far. And we recognise that we do have a certain amount of impasse still in the background. But I think what will be helpful is to unpack more on the how, and what our mechanisms potentially are within the cohort of the public sector funds that are being made available, and then the private sector funds that will underpin that. And if we have a look at that 20 billion, we're recognising as well that the 20 billion is public sector funding potentially, right? In a guise, it could be public-private type funding, but it's coming from the drive behind is public sector funding. The scale will result from private sector kind of having put those building blocks in place, then it will catalyse the private sector. So let's just unpack how we see from a cohort of sovereign public funding perspectives this can be provided. Number one, based on some of the bilateral relationships we already have, we see some of those funds, and we can talk about those amounts separately, but budget support, so funds flowing to the fiscus as budgetary support. With this support, we'll have identified the policy and regulatory elements that you've made progress on. So we could potentially call that like a prior action recognition and provide that money upfront. And we have talked in some of our discussions, but how many strings are attached to this funding that are coming? That could potentially be a kind of a no strings attached type of structure, because you have already made significant progress with regard to your policy and regulatory frameworks. So not all of it at once, but potentially in tranches, because we've got the 10-year window. Potentially then, just following on that theme of budgetary support, we could potentially provide you with another set of funding, where we might need to have a look at the progress that has been made in between the initial kind of set of fundamentals and looking towards more implementation of those policies. And once that has been achieved, or is on the path to be achieved, we can kind of have a results-based framework for that budgetary support. We are not expecting, with that budgetary support, to you for you to earmark. We've recognized your pushback on the earmarking. We're not going to have a look at an earmarking of that specific fund. Remembering it's one or two of the members of our cohort of funders. There are other members of our cohort that would prefer to see implementation and looking at it, although on a portfolio basis, because we're going to be looking at a program, but still recognizing that these projects are going to be done on a project by project basis, and these projects could be via a public procurement initiative, bringing on the private sector. And that private sector engagement and bringing on the private sector could be in the form of debt and equity. That could be discussed. You very, very importantly, Chantal mentioned grants, and I know that's very sensitive, and I'm very much aware that you're a bit concerned that the level of grants is probably under-resourced, and that we'll have to unpack as the discussions go forward. But we'd like to propose that the grants are earmarked for technical assistance, where that technical assistance can possibly look at providing some feasibility study, early funding, but also, I think more importantly, is to work on the just transition elements. Because I think we haven't reached the stage, and this is, I think, where some of the impasse comes. How do we bring those just transition elements into that program? So we'd like to propose that some of the grants really look at deep dives and solutions to bring in the private sector. So what I'm saying here is that we can't commit to the portfolio approach in a big space where we are in time, but it's a forward-looking funding that's been put on the table, the grants, with a view to actually having a look at structuring and how we bring on the just elements. And we recognise that it's quite a complex ask in bringing the just elements on board, but we absolutely, as sovereigns, believe that the just elements are critical to the success, especially the long-term success. We also we do recognise that your fiscal frameworks are constrained. So again, I just want to emphasise the revenue model is going to be key. So in structuring that, we're going to have a really deep dive conversation on how those are going to be structured. But I'd like to hear from my private sector colleague on how you believe that this set of funding that's been put to catalyse yourselves is helping you in bringing on the scale, and what else you would like to see in unpacking some of those frameworks.
Thanks, Penny. Yeah, so I think just to add to that, and I think we have some ideas as well around the grant piece, augmenting that grant piece, which I can touch on in a second. I think from our perspective, there's some key questions around who makes the final investment decision. And so what the process looks like around that. And so in terms of the legal protections, as we talked about previously on sort of political overrides. And I think there's certainly a keenness I'm hearing from my side around a dual signature authority on that fund account. And so ways that we can be partners in exactly how those funds are dispersed. There's questions around, again, stability on policy, so particularly on the energy side and how feed-in tariffs are looking, and how I know your government is very keen to promote independent power producers and grid connections, and just the stability of that policy. So if there's an ability to have a side letter around that policy stability, particularly around feed-in tariffs. And I think also then around just really reporting, I think, in terms of some of the key KPIs, it'd be good to get into some of the detail around how that reporting comes back from that fund account. I'm particularly keen to see, Penny, from your side, they said, we touched on it earlier, some of the early stage, what level in the capital stack you're going to be playing. That's ideally that junior mezzanine piece. And just to see exactly how we can go through the various different sectors and the piece that you'll play within that. And then one of the things I thought we could bring to the table is maybe we've seen this before, the just transition pooling mechanism, whereby revenue from some of the projects that are over the course of the 2 to 3 to maybe 5 years, some of that revenue can then be recycled, and that revenue can be recycled into some of the lower generating, revenue generating, some of the just transition projects that I know are making part of this package. So maybe we could look at that. Penny, please.
James, before we give Chantal an opportunity to respond, I'd like to respond to your capital stack question. We do recognise that that there's going to be a certain amount of focus on risk. So the risk sharing mechanism and those instruments that we are going to have to discuss might not be in today's discussion, but looking forward, we'll have to consider what the private sector is asking in terms of that capital stack and where some of that risk will be taken on board, whether it's kind of very junior funding that we might be able to access from some of the partners and some of their intermediaries. Those conversations might have to take place. But I think what we would be seeking the recognition of from your point of view is that there is going to be a need for de-risking mechanisms. And then a hard look at, in those de-risking mechanisms, how we allocate some of that risk.
Happy to say risk sharing. Happy to say risk sharing.
Thank you. Risk sharing is what I had in mind. So, yeah.
Do either of you know anybody that's lost their job or had a failed business? I'm just parking that thought there, right? Because we're speaking in ways that are about term sheets and very disconnected technological things that we are building. I can take all of this back to our treasury, and we're probably going to have a very academic conversation about this. But it is devoid of the other parts of government that have got to sell this to their constituencies, including regional and national government at the same time. So without any kind of certainty, of the social cohesion that we need to keep in mind, as I said in my opening remarks, right? We need to first build that social safety net. And part of the conversation about what needs to get funded and how it gets funded and what mechanisms we have and whether it's a pooling system or an entity or whatever else, I think I'm still failing to see whether, as a consortium of funders, as much as I respect all of the different ideas and recognition that this has to have and work on the just transition elements, right? The just transition for our country isn't just about an element of a bigger pool, it's the heart of it. Right, so the first thing we need to do is, and it's, I guess we are asking about the way we do funding, right? We've got enough track record with your consortium and some of the others that you say are new to our country, but there's enough of track record in history of how this let's call it a game if you indulge me. I know it isn't a game, but there is a degree of international development architecture and national architecture that actually is the status quo, but we're not talking about the status quo. We are talking about people that are going to lose their jobs, and they've got at least 4 or 5 people that are dependent on them for livelihoods. They've got small little businesses around the places where they're going to lose their jobs, and that is like small little, indirect businesses, supply chains, if you want, that are going to be directly affected. Local governments and regional governments that are going to be affected by shutdown of certain elements. And the biggest problem with how we've seen some of this unfold in the past, which is the hard sell, is that the sequencing out of it is completely out. We first prioritize the revenue generation, and then we go, oh, oops, we've got to now finance, the just transition elements. And we call it that, so then we, create some side project. But to plan with people in the center and to plan and design this 20 billion, because it's a substantive amount, and we're grateful for that, honestly, but we've got to do it differently from the way it's normally done. We can't do it the same way, which means every single project, whether I would ideally love to say that all of these projects are revenue generating. We're not saying we need non and we don't want to split it that way. But if we made every possible project a revenue generating one that was able to absorb the just focus within them, and what might that look like? When you build a power plant, you've got to create parallel economies. You've got to create hold one stable and build up the other to a significant state in such a way that when you switch across, you are reducing the impact on livelihoods and businesses and communities in that space. And at some point, because not everybody is going to have a job, there's some that are not going to have a job. And what we've seen is the promise of jobs and new skills and new industries, but there's a time lag. And how are they going to feed their families in the meantime with that time lag? So if we can't think together differently about how we package and originate these projects so that they're all revenue generating, it should not need to be revenue generating. Transport and energy, don't you think so, Armando?
Yeah, Henny, James, during our coffee break, I was talking to one of the members of your delegation, and he stressed, we need to identify what is the revenue generating aspect. And then, James, you ask us, how do we bring the just transition into this? Well, it's by stop looking at just what makes revenue and then recycle that and apply it to social. Since I'm private sector, I'm representing private sector, let me put it in a private sector analogy. If you're implementing a company-wide strategy, you're not going to start one department at a time. You're not just going to look at the department that gives you revenue. You need to look at it as a whole, and that's what we're asking. Now, I understand the hesitation about political wins. No one suffers that more locally than the private sector. But we can't stop and wait for certainty. Otherwise, we wouldn't do business in our country. We go out there, we see what the need is, and we finance it. So I guess that's what we're asking when we look at a portfolio. It's not a project by project. It's a whole funding. And look, I understand another one of your delegates was saying, well, what shut down the idea of having this entity to look at origination? We never shut it down. In fact, I would say let's create an independent institution where you sit, private sector sits, government sits, but it doesn't kind of hold the strings to the purse of saying, well, this milestone has been achieved, now you can access this fund. Oh, this is the sequencing, let's continue with that, independent of political wins.
If I can just build on the entity idea, you want institutions that are fit for purpose. We're not trying to create institutions for the sake of it. I think definitely, countries in a similar position are quite tired of new funds being created, new entities being created, when you've actually got capacitated institutions in the country. So with a little bit of planning and appreciating who can bear the risk, who can best originate, and at what level, does that funding need to be available, then we create a space for thinking about what we're wanting to deliver, government offering that direction and allowing innovation to happen. I think the problem with creating too many structures, not to contradict what Armando is saying, because it has its relevance, but not every context. So we wouldn't want that to be imposed on the sovereign. Neither do we want it to be imposed on the ability of private sector to innovate in such a way. We're trying to give appropriate directionality to this transition, but ensuring that you make people the center, the disruptive impacts on small businesses, especially local government, and the direct jobs who have got indirect beneficiaries, plus the indirect jobs that support that. So it's about constructing, if you want to call it a project in a holistic sense, but a suite of projects that enable us to, and that means the 20 billion has to pitch up differently. Because at the minute our hands are tied in that you want us to operate like this in different lanes, but we don't have certainty that we can sell this to our constituents, the people that elected us, the government, that, there's 5 different projects that are going to happen in this region, but the sum of the parts is not always greater than the whole, actually. I hope I got that the right way around, but you know what I mean. Like you break it up, and then we think it's going to work better. Sometimes it doesn't do that, and we can't afford in this geopolitical moment to create more social, disunity.
I hear what you're saying, Chantal. But just to come back to the cohort of financiers on our side, there are elements, but there are only certain elements, like budgetary support, that can go towards that, which gives you the fiscal space to determine how you're going to use those funds. Are you going to apply them? Are you prepared to earmark those funds for specific, that we are offering you significant amounts of? Are you prepared to earmark them? How are we going to see that evidenced in your budget? Are you going to track those elements, the money that we are providing, the funds that are being provided? Are you going to track those elements through your budget? Will we, on the other hand, be able to say, if we're looking forward, remember we talked about 2 different tranches of potential funding, and I'm not even involving the private sector at this stage. I'm just trying to address the just elements. Those just elements will be deeply embedded in those actions to give the country confidence that the funding has been provided to do that. And in that plan that we're busy working on, looking at how are we going to ensure that you, from a country perspective, have included those elements. And but the project elements that we've got to have a look at, and bringing on the private sector again, don't necessarily include those elements. They can to some extent, but from a revenue point of view, we can't expect the private sector to take on the responsibility of a big systemic just transition. There could be elements of it in the projects, but there's a bigger picture here, and that's why we're providing a lot of budgetary support in this mix, for you to go back and think on how you're going to bring that justness into it. And we would like to see that in the plan. Remember, we have a fiduciary duty to our public sector to give the comfort that we've actually done our due diligence, and we're really comfortable that your country has thought this through and has that bigger strategic vision. And I hear you have it, but we need to understand how we're going to implement it. So for me, it's kind of how that's going to be implemented. I know you're eager, but I would like to, is there anything my colleague would like to say before you respond?
No.
I understand that your flights will be leaving soon for the funders, but perhaps one final word.
Yeah. I don't mind them missing their flight. I guess, I feel like where we're getting stuck, honestly, is budget support isn't enough, right? It's not enough. It hardly ever is enough, right? We're having a technical conversation that we're wanting to do the way we originate these, these portfolios. We want to do that differently. We are trying to assure you that revenue generative doesn't have to be a trade-off. Justice and revenue generation is not a trade-off. It has to happen because our country has to grow economically. We need the socio-economic stability. But perhaps we don't have the right vocabulary between us, because essential for us is the fact that we're trying to move to a new paradigm of finance, right? So often the conversation is, as a country, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and then the funding would line up. I guess what there seems to be a challenge with is that from a funder's perspective, we need a little bit of imagination also, that some things need to change. Your instruments are the same that we've had for all this time. How you've deployed them is more or less the same. Bilateral lines, going into treasury, all of that. We're not having an instrument discussion. We're actually asking you about how we put this together, because most of your consortium is active in our country already. We need to do this differently. How do we package and originate this vision of a systemic effect differently? That's where we're getting stuck. And we've tried a little with the private sector. Amanda's no easy guy to convince, but I think you're getting there, right?
Yeah, look, we have to move away. That private sector just comes in to mobilize and de-risk. We've tried that, it's not working. We have to be part. It can't just be public budget.
Absolutely, it is not budget. It's definitely not all public budget, because we've also had a look at how some of our entities can use the funding for the private sector. So it's not only public. It's not only public budget. And I think that the elements that you're raising, Chantal, would require a lot more innovative thought in terms of how to package that. You will recall that earlier on in our discussions that we have a timeline and a deadline that we're working towards. And we're 3 months away from that. I think the level of detail you're requesting us to go into might be better suited in an implementation stage than trying to figure it out now, where we kind of look at those innovative mechanisms. But if we have already agreed that timelines are really important, we've got to come to some agreement that there's going to be work going forward. And that devil in the detail is complex. So I think we're very much aligned. It's just a question of time and how we're going to unpack that. And I realize as well as unpacking that going forward, there's a lot more work to do and a lot more water under the bridge and probably a lot more time that needs to go by before we actually get into the stage of implementation. Unfortunately, we've both agreed that timelines are our absolute red line in terms of getting the initial stage completed.
And not just in this negotiation, but also in this process. So thank you to our participants. We'll take them out of character in just a second, but firstly I'm going to direct you to your next set of questions. So clearly some progress there, but also I'm struck by how confident Penny is that everyone is completely aligned. Please go to your Mentimeters and then give me some thoughts on the next question. So to what extent do you think that what the funders are offering is really meeting the country's needs? And while you're doing that, maybe just one or two reflections of my own. I think that this question that comes up on the countryside comes up a lot with the public donors, which is this notion of, well, they're already active in the country, and yet they seem to be extremely nervous about political risks in a way that might be more fit for entities that haven't been active in the country. So perhaps that suggests that the public sector entities on the funder side are somewhat influenced by the involvement maybe of the private sector who maybe haven't necessarily been involved in the country. Okay, so, brutal. Not at all, says someone. So someone really thinks that we have reached an impasse. We got a not really and a no. There's a little bit. There's a little bit more.
You might want to refresh.
Yeah. When it comes to that, I think there is a. Sorry, can you do that?
Sure.
There is a sense clearly that the funders are making some accommodations, but more through technical innovations, financial innovations, and really struggling certainly to recognise the importance of looking at the justice and people-centred elements right up front. Someone's got 3 to 4 out of 10, which is very, very specific. More imagination needed in capital letters on both sides.
I'd like to hear.
Does anyone who want to own up to that response? Because I think it's
in a good way. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is we're playing out reality here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sandy.
Yeah.
So, watching this, so from the countryside, I understand all the elements and needs of what you need, and it obviously completely makes sense. But I would argue if you were to have that 20 billion with no strings attached, it would still be difficult to achieve those objectives, right? But here, a return needs to be made, and there's no getting around that. And then you say that justice isn't a trade-off from revenue, and it isn't. But often the activities and investments that deliver social outcomes and especially for adaptation and resilience, which is more sort of system type thinking, the returns, there aren't traditional revenue streams from those activities and investments, and if they are, they're low and long. So I don't think they're saying that, it is a trade-off, but they're saying let's take things with traditional revenue streams, with established markets, and how can we use that to deliver social outcomes in a just way. But I think maybe there's some work to do on, I think you're asking for some like first principles approach and to have these hard lines before you even go into how and what the funding is. But I think you're both on the same page, but maybe more work needs to be done before you get into the detail.
And intriguingly, if we go to the just before we go to the next person, if you give us an answer to the final question, which is why do we? We're assuming that you think that the party's not finding each other to an extent, and the question is sort of why. Right now, there seems to be. Well, I'll wait for a few more responses on that to see if it.
There's quite a few now. This
gentleman
on the front, I think, is coming here.
It's coming, yes.
I think the reason why this isn't, to unpack a little bit what the problem is here, because I think the way the parties are talking is not terribly, it's a little bit opaque, right? Is that, but certain words like tariffs bring it out, what is really going on here, which is that the government, the borrower, is saying essentially that if the projects don't produce jobs and energy prices that are politically sustainable, the entire thing is going to collapse. Right? The lenders are saying, we'll take care of whatever those issues are, we'll take care of them through grants. Right? But that will not work. Right? If we step aside from this scenario, right, what we're talking about is the South African energy sector, and it didn't work. And these folks are trying to tell the funders that grants aren't going to do it. It has to be in the structure of the energy economy, both in the jobs and the consumer impact. And jobs goes also to small business and so forth. Right? And the problem here, fundamentally, is that the structure of what is being done here, meaning the minimums that these folks need, right, will not accommodate what will provide political stability in the borrower.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so it's not just a question of a difference in language here, which I think you alluded to. You perhaps using similar words. Justice is often one of those, right? To mean very different things, but also that structurally we have a gap here.
Well, if you just be even more concrete, if you pay if in renewables projects that are going to generate IRRs that are going to be acceptable to foreign private investors, you pay the same wages that a parastatal power company is paying. Right? If you do that, you can't possibly generate the IRR that these folks are going to need. Yep. And if you don't do it, the people who are going to be affected in the parastatal will overthrow your government.
Okay, that's very concrete, as you say. Perhaps the gentleman on the left-hand side in the back, with the glasses and the beard.
Glasses and the beard were matching.
I was about to say, I'm not really distinguishing too much.
It's in vogue. And thank you to all the players. You guys are amazing. Zach Brownstein, I'm here with Climate Connectors. One thing that I wasn't hearing as much was framing around kind of win-wins. It was very clear that both sides were trying to move their positions forward, but a little less of the kind of seeing through the lens of the parties on the other side and where are there opportunities to overlap. So for example, from the funders side of the table, there's a recognition of what is it that we are trying to get here, right? Of course there is capital that is here to be had. There is money in the just transition. There's a lot of money in the just transition. But there's also ESG obligations, net zero goals, following through on promises. And so on the the countryside, right, being able to lean into some of those areas and say, like, these are some of the wins here. The other thing that I didn't hear as much, which felt very key, and of course we're talking a hypothetical situation, but this question of return rates. Where we decide of how much money are the donors or the funders going to be making on here provides a vast array of what can be fundable in those areas, and there are number of examples of interesting bundled mechanisms where some of the providing transitions when it comes to jobs or training or things like that, or funding projects that are less profitable, can be part of an overall package if the return rates are such, especially for the more profitable pieces, that they can cover those. And so kind of having ways or approaching via fixed income where we can say, hey, this is the number we're aiming for. All right, we're aligned on we're happy to take this much money in. All right, great. What are some of the projects, what are some of the things that we can fund that will allow us to achieve that number?
Thank you very much. I should say that in an original version of this planning, there was an idea to have a substantially longer event, and getting these guys to condense their thoughts just even to this amount of time has been enough of a challenge. But no, that makes sense. And there seems to be it seems to be a bit of a tie really as to the extent to which people ultimately feel that there is enough of that productive collaboration going on, or really whether the barriers are proving too much to surmount. And of course, this is a simplified example focused on a country and its power system. And many countries out there, speaking from my own experience, also need to consider a systemic re-examination of a future if they happen to be very dependent on fossil fuel exports, for example, or particularly dependent on fossil fuel production taxes. And once you start to add those elements into specific countries, then the systemic nature of the challenge really does become clear. Okay, so we, I think, are at a point where we can allow our participants to come out of character. And we have a bit of time for some direct questions as well. Also like to give them a chance towards the end to give some personal reflections. But does anyone want to? You guys can also come out of character as well if you like. Anyone else have something to say or questions to ask of our participants? In the middle there.
Hi, Chav Meetle from Climate Policy Initiative. I think what we are trying to achieve here is fair outcomes through these unjust processes. Like what I see, I mean, not getting out of character, but like what we heard from the donor perspective was more like short, like focused on what donor wants or what their preferences look like, rather than what locally is needed. And the point about like they need capacity building, they need resourcing to build that project pipeline, right? So we never even talked about those aspects. I mean, obviously it's a short time, so I think those sort of things, aspects needs to be built in as well. Another thing is like the flexibility, right? What we are trying to do is our countries are just not getting or phasing out of coal. They are, they're entering into a transition, and that into has a lot of uncertainties. So I think when they're kind of planning out the packages or instruments, etc., that flexibility or uncertainty needs to be kind of built in.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we'll take one more and then get the panelists to respond. Lady at the back in the middle.
Thanks, Lily Hartzell from E3G. This is more of an observation and building on my CPI colleagues' comment as well. I think something I was struck by is that neither side asked the other a question throughout the entire session. And I know part of that is just, it's a simulation, you're short on time, but I was particularly struck that the funder side, I personally in the audience was confused by a lot of the kind of terminology that the countryside kept repeating, systemic approach and different pieces, and that became more clear over time, particularly as tensions rose a little bit. But I think it would have been it was striking to me that there was no effort made to kind of really dig into, well, what are we talking about here? And kind of, I think there was a potential breakthrough when you realize, like, oh, maybe everything we're talking about here is revenue generating, which I think fundamentally changes what the funder side would think about in terms of their package and how they might be conceptualizing this. But to reach that realization fairly late in the process meant we got pretty far off the rails. And so I think the lack of really kind of second, third, fourth follow-up questions from the funder side, particularly towards the country, to understand what they're really envisioning here before we get into the details of the kind of term sheet, I think could have helped unlock a little bit some of the progress.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody on the stage like to give a reflection on those 2 points? Particularly when it comes, Chantal, and perhaps to the point there around the extent to which those kind of ultimately fundamental misunderstandings can persist, further into the process and hinder things.
Yeah. I mean, obviously this was a compressed moment, right? And I did try in the intro to say what we are trying to understand is whether you understand what we are asking for, right? Do you actually understand our needs? And then our comeback when they went straight into the level of detail is again that tension of actually what actually happens in reality. It's almost we make assumptions that we understand each other. Because we're trying to do something different, right? Hopefully, but I think that's why my own experience has been we rushed too quickly to get to the specifics of term sheet. It was the comment the lady that's leaving the room now made about I guess we were missing each other, and I suppose that's partly what we wanted to demonstrate to all of you as well. We didn't script any of this, so this is played out in the way that it played out. We just had direction. But you're right, but there's limited patience because from a country's perspective, we know that the funders have committed, their credit committees, they've got budgets that have been set aside for a year. There's all of these dynamics, so they need to bank, in a way, the funding and the space for meta-level engagement. And understanding and appreciation of what needs to happen is actually quite limited. So I think part of the systemic challenge is we rush to the solutions before we understand the problem and the needs of what needs to be funded and the drivers, as you eloquently put out, that if you want that to drive it, you need space for conversation. But in most financing negotiations, we don't have that. We make so many assumptions about what a country needs. And we're like, oh, but it's in your NDC. No, it's in this plan. No, it's their new transition plan. A plan is not necessarily equal to resource mobilization. It's Delemi sitting in the audience. It's one of her favorite, hypotheses. We can't necessarily say the one is equal to the other because in practice it hasn't worked out that way. So, yeah, my core reflection on that would be the way things play out, there's no time to actually say, but we don't mean that. Because everybody wants to say, is it a debt, is it equity, is it grants, is it this, is it that? What we were trying to say is you need to originate and think about finance a little bit differently. And you might remember I did ask, do you understand what we mean by systemic investment, right? It was brushed aside eloquently by Penny. A little bit. Okay, she's going to kill me afterwards. Don't worry.
And so both sides, to an extent, also struggle due to the way in which the negotiation is put together to have the openness and brain space to consider the various different incentives, not just technical ones, but also political ones. And we've heard it a lot on both sides, also driving the partners' urge to de-risk the international private sector. Any more questions from the room? There's one at the back there.
You did also just simply ask, have you ever met anyone who's lost their job, or I can't remember your other second question. And there's an abundance of expertise in both character and people on stage, but really that's the question I think this discussion is about. What do remember we're all liable to lose our job. We're kind of on the lucky side of the fence, maybe, I suppose, in being able to have these conversations, the luxury of them. I don't work in a coal plant that needs to be decommissioned in the next decade right now. If anything, I'm sort of working to decommission that coal plant. So what am I doing to think about the person who might lose their job? I think that's the very simple question that is at the center of this conversation and shouldn't be lost in the 20 billion kind of numbers or capital stacks or any other kind of very necessary mechanistic conversations and not to lose sight of.
Thanks, and I think anyone who's worked in the sustainable finance industry and ESG in London in the last year or so will also know that fear a little bit around how political change can drive action. I think were there any more questions on this side? Lady at the
one right next to you, Matt.
second row.
Thank you. I'm Laura. I'm from the British Embassy in Jakarta, and I'm very happy to be here. This sounds very similar. I just wanted to highlight a few observations. So one is the conversation around institutional arrangement. I don't think we heard anything with regards to that, and that's really, really important to solidify the conversation, because you mentioned in the beginning that this conversation has happened over and over again. So there is a need to formalize somehow this offer and your expectations on the countryside. We need to have a Venn diagram of what you want and what your expectations are. So on the funder side, you want accountability, and on the countryside, you want certainty. So if you just have everything on paper and then you go back and forth and answer each other's question, it might be more productive than just having meetings. I'll stop there.
Thank you. We've got two more questions, but before everyone forgets what those questions and comments were, do you guys on the funder side want to give or the previous funder side want to give a view? Penny, maybe?
No, sorry, I've kind of focused on a much earlier comment, actually from the first round, and that was from the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia, where I was struck by your comment to say what you're grappling with is bankability on projects, right? So you've kind of got to where you've got to acknowledging that this part of that conversation on projects is where you're struggling, right? And I think it's really important to understand that, because as we've seen a lot of comments that the just transitions are just not happening and we're still not able to unlock that funding. It's because we're still having the same conversation that we've just had here. We're not doing anything differently, guys. Sorry, and I'm coming out of character as well now, right? Because when I got told I'm going to be on this side of the table, I'm like, no, you can't be serious, right? Because this is not me, right? So I really do believe we've got to go about this differently, because what you said was like, wow, here we are. And we're having those conversations in country as well. Wherever they are. I've listened to a number of feedbacks on the just transition where they're trying to implement. The justness is not embedded systemically. It's not. But I don't want to place the blame, if we're looking at, and I don't want to point fingers, as I'm not looking to place blame, on a country recipient or one of the funders. It's because we both haven't changed our mindsets. We both haven't thought deeply about this. And we have, and I feel very strongly about this, having participated in one of these kind of on the ground. We are being driven by timelines. And those timelines have not allowed us to unpack to the extent that we need to. And therefore the success is at risk. Success of implementation is largely at risk. Another comment I want to make is, don't assume that one country's, and it's almost like we're chasing the money and not the detail. So it's money. As Chantal alluded to, the money was placed on the table. Okay, we've got a pot of money, how are we going to do this, right? Not thinking, how are we going to do this differently? Just how are we going to do this? Maybe the country has said, but also I don't believe that countries have also properly articulated on the how. Some have said, okay, we're going to do it this way, we're going to establish an entity where the funds can flow through. Others have said, no, that's not the way we're going to evolve. So I still have a sense of frustration coming out of character, that if I had my life over again, these past 3 years or going back 3 or 4 years, I really would have said, I can't stay in this room anymore, because there are some of these issues that have been highlighted. And we've just let it slip. And now we're patching afterwards, trying to patch, like looking for bankable projects and having issues in terms of bringing those justice elements on board. Supporting the country, though, we all know that there's a fiscal constraint. And that fiscal constraint's not only developing countries, it's also developed countries. We're seeing that fiscal constraint emerge very strongly. And I think those fiscal constraints potentially now might be better understood. If we had these conversations on getting some of this just transition work going forward, we might have been able to have a more equal conversation on those just elements. I think from an implementation point of view, I think just transitions are struggling. And they're struggling because of that lack of embeddedness, but also not properly highlighting how we see that working and how budgets actually work. Budgets need to be looked at differently, right, from a country perspective.
And there's always a challenge to work out what's really driving the timelines, right? And I guess I'd be curious over coffee to hear from the participants as to the extent to which all of these things have shifted during the process as US interest rates have risen, geopolitical situations become more volatile, etc. But I think we maybe have
Can I just make one last comment? And Chantal knows me because I keep on saying this. I've kept on asking, what is the revenue model? Whether it's a non-revenue model, and there's a part of it, I think, as this gentleman in front alluded to as well, I recognise them, but we have not seen a revenue model, a proper revenue model that says this is the holistic approach, and a revenue model over time. We focus as countries on, a year, a sort of short-term wins, the medium and the long term. There's nothing in budgets on the long term, in the medium term. I don't even know in developed countries whether it's really on the long, maybe starting to look at it. And that's where we're missing it, right? I think we really are missing it. Anyway, let me not say any more on that.
Well, look, we're at. Can I ask how much additional time do we have beyond the? Do we think? About 15 extra minutes. Okay, brilliant. But there were 2 questions on this side first. At the back.
Thank you, Joe Thwaites, NRDC. I think the timeline piece is really important in the context setting of this had leaked, so there was a sort of sense of pressure. The media was starting to ask questions, and you needed to have sort of a public package, and we all know that kind of happened with a lot of the JETPs, not just the South African one. The subtext that I picked up on, and I'm curious to get your reflection on it, is from both government sides a lack of trust about the depth of political commitment and strength of political commitment. So from the recipient country, a sort of the constant constraints about mandates, and it's like, well, if this is a real political priority, you can work around those. The mandates can be moved and can be made more flexible. So from that frustration with the funders of you've kind of left this to the upper middle management rather than political leaders, or got the real buy-in to sort of shift stuff. And then I think from the funders' side of how bought in is the whole of your government to this process? Are we just talking to a few champions here, or are we talking to the whole government? So I don't know if that was conscious or not, but that's what I picked up from it.
Perhaps one more. You had a follow-up.
A very quick question about your character, which is there's a moment in which.
1 second, sorry. Thanks.
Sorry, and I should say I'm Damon Silvers. I teach at UCL on climate and labor, and I advise the U.S. trade union movement on same subject. Also Jubilee, the global debt network. My question to you was, your character changed tone at a certain moment. Why?
Right, perhaps we should start with you.
Help
the one with the
me understand, what moment was it?
The moment which you said,
job.
have you ever lost your job?
It was the jobs moment.
The whole conversation was extremely diplomatic and slightly opaque, and then suddenly it wasn't. Why?
Well, so fully coming out of character and going fully into so I've worked at GCF, I worked in SA on various things. I've been in spaces where you see moments, right? And I think my first experience of climate was at the Asian Development Bank. I was working in a development finance institute, and climate finance stuff was being put up, and I kept thinking, this is so dehumanized. Right? We forget that there are people that are affected. We forget their lives are affected. All the imagery was of graphs about CO2 emissions going up, and this was in 2009. And I kept thinking, where are the people? Because we're speaking as if though we are robots. We're speaking as if though we are AI programmed individuals. And in real experiences that I've had, it has been when you bring it back to the fact that make it personal for somebody. Penny and James are individuals with families and lives and, mortgage bonds maybe to repay and, children to feed. So it was just to try and make it much more personal, because everything else ends up becoming a technical conversation. And any investment around climate or even development for me is not a technical conversation. It's about people are there. People's livelihoods are going to be affected. And to make the just transition real is about putting them at the center, putting us as a species actually at the center and how we're going to be affected. I'm sure we know at least one person sitting and working in a coal mine, or somebody living in a coal, focused town. It's not devoid of us, but all of our conversation, and I think that's why the partnership with GFI over the last year has been so good, because between James and I, we have appreciated that to get to a better place of understanding, we have to blur the lines and eradicate the lines between north providers of funders and southern recipients of funders. This is not a helpful conversation. We have to separate the lines between public and private as well. We're kind of in this together. It's an entitled self-interest of everybody to make the just transition. Well, we know we need to do the transition from a technological perspective, but we seem to be so stuck with how are we going to make this socially acceptable, but we're human beings, right? I feel so strongly about the fact that we've forgotten that part, and we have conversations about term sheets and structures and institutional forms and instruments in such a way that's so devoid of how people's lives are going to be affected. And so that's why it does go back to, I think, what you said about the meta-level, higher-level frameworks that need to have been had, and we're not having those conversations. So that's why I changed gear, because it's like, what the hell? Surely, if you've lost a job, you understand. I don't care about clean and green and whatever. I can't feed my kids, right? And if I can't have security that I can't feed my family and take care of them, you're a dad? So, if you had a coal job, would you stand up against some green company coming in to take away your job?
Well, I know lots of coal miners.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So, that's the other thing, that they are not the bad guys, right?
I think that there's some lessons that our politicians here in the UK can learn from that, given that there's a generation, my own really, who became adults after much of that work had happened and was people were left to rot. So time for one more question, I think, or we can cover it in there or in.
There's a few Laudes colleagues in the room, and I'd just like to say I'm privileged that we've got our logo up there with you guys. It's been a great session. I was just reflecting on the role of philanthropy, because we got a bit of a mention here, and mostly we get approached to de-risk, project originate, and see if we can sort of tweak the numbers so that it all stacks up and somebody can make a profit out of it. And I just reflecting on the role of philanthropy in all of this, because I don't think it's that.
Thank you very much. That's a conversation I'd like to continue as to whether that's changed since US interest rates went up. Anyway, we're pretty much out of time, and I want to give the chance for our panelists also to give any personal reflections on the process, anything that you particular that you will take away to your next engagements on this topic. James, I don't know if you haven't had a chance to go yet.
No, thanks. I've been fascinated, and thank you everyone for leaning in. I've been making notes rapidly here. I think, just on that point, Claire, and others, I've got for me, the two things I've written down here around timeline pressures and revenue models. And so for me, the timeline pressure, we've got to work out a way of short-circuiting that. That's something in the GFI we work on quite a lot, because if you're setting up a green bank or a green window, whatever you might call it, as soon as you put numbers behind it and you put capital behind it, there's then pressure to deploy straight away. So there's a sequencing problem here around if you put financial institutions with money, they want to they have fiduciary duty, capital pressures, etc. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's about the sequencing of how we do that. And so for me, that timeline needs to be done appropriately, and I think the way that philanthropy can work is to get organisations to work out how you can short-circuit those timelines. And then I think what those organisations should then be doing is exactly as developing. We touched on it briefly, and a gentleman over there talked about SPVs was what was in my head. Is we find ways of, and it's not just through grants, of investing in non-revenue generating projects. We do it all the time, VC structures and the like. And I'm not suggesting that it's an equity investment that people that don't have a skin in the game in the transition do. We have community stock ownership instruments and the like. So I think there's a practical way of doing this at scale that we haven't worked through yet. We're still quickly into this conversation about it's 20 billion, right? How? But we need to short circuit that. But there were things there, practical things there in terms of financial architecture, financial instruments that I'm keen that we look at and we start to work out how to develop.
Thanks. And presumably the existing financial architecture and the existing work that's happened in countries over many years will be a starting point, and it's something that funders aren't often aware of, right? Particular financial innovations or structures or actors, which will vary quite a lot by country. So maybe to you, Armando.
Sure. A bit like Penny, I was kind of forced outside of my comfort zone, because not even 2 years ago, I was at the World Bank having that conversation with private banks and telling them how to do and what to do in their own markets. Luckily, I've plugged out of the matrix. And I now understand that return on investment is not just financial, right? And my favorite part of the simulation was when James went, no. Because I've been in that room where private equity, where asset managers hear non-financial returns and just switch off, plug off, leave the room. So yeah, it was. I was playing a bit of a dream role in which I was private sector saying yes for social development and social justice. The reality is we don't usually see that, right? So it was a bit of a liberty that we took, but it was important to kind of push the funder side. Yeah.
Well, there's a fight ongoing within each and every financial sector, private financial sector organisation on that very topic.
Correct.
Right? So, okay. So perhaps any final words, Penny?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Throughout some of this just transition processes, I keep on asking myself, what type of investors do we need? And I don't think we're bold enough to go that way. And I just want to address the kind of potentially make assumptions on those of you that are sitting in the room, including myself, is that largely we're looking to secure our financial future, and investors also looking to secure the financial futures of the money that they receive to provide for your retirement. And there's a very different flavor in a developing country. We're not looking at providing for our retirement, right, where investors are. we've got a large population that are looking to put money on the put food on the table. And there's such a, you can drive buses between those two groups. And to bring them together is, I don't even know whether we're ever going to get there. I'm sorry, I'm pretty concerned that we aren't. I'm also concerned that in the just transition process, we've left and we said, okay, we've concluded this just transition for country A, B, or C, and now it's up to implementation. And we're not having those deep conversations. We're not continuing with them on how we're going to achieve more equality, more dignity in the financial world, to recognize that there's this big divide between trying to provide long-term stability for ourselves as potentially privileged in the room and those that are not privileged enough at this stage, and to bring them and create that justice platform. I'd just like to read, and I'd just like to share, because I read a lot, right? I'd like to share a quote from one of my favorite kind of books and authors, and you might know this book. It's called Fierce Conversations, and it's written by a lady called Susan Scott, and you can YouTube her. She says, our work, our relationship, and in fact, our very lives succeed or fail gradually. Then suddenly, as per Hemingway, one conversation at a time. Yeah. And I feel that if we do not engage more in kind of structures like this, but up front as well, that we are going to not have those deep and fierce conversations that will allow us to move. So I'm very privileged to have been here. Thank you very much to those that have contributed to this, because we have to come out. We have to come out and be real and explore our vulnerabilities and acknowledge that we aren't doing what we need to do for justice in the world. We definitely aren't. And consider how we contribute to it. So thank you very much for allowing me the privilege to be here.
Thank you. And the final word to Chantal.
So I think I was probably the most comfortable in terms of my role. I didn't have to
or the most triggered, perhaps.
Or the most triggered. I think that is very true. I definitely was the most triggered. Actually, when we were planning the session, Armando and I had a sort of a 10-minute spat. He was in IFC role and I was country-wise. It took me 3 days to come down from like absolute anger. I told you, right? I was so angry, and I realized there is so much unfinished business that I have on a personal level, and I think a lot of us working in this space have. And I suppose in bringing myself down from that, red zone, I had to find a way of saying, but what am I struggling with? Because I think what I'm most struggling with is that beyond creating the meta frameworks and the narratives and the plans, both sides, as in all sides, don't have like practical tools really, and practical ways of saying, well, you're saying that, but what does it look like? In my term sheet, what does it look like in an origination strategy? How do we make this practical? And I think a lot more work has to go into that. I've spent a long time working in climate finance and finance more generally. And it's very easy to have the finance conversations, risk, all of those lovely things. We know those conversations. But I think those of us working in this space first, I felt it when I was sitting in some of these discussions. You need courage in the moment, because sometimes your own team's not going to back you up. So if you believe in something, you have to fight harder. You have to fight for it. And you can't back down, because at some point it all becomes personal, right? Most of us working in climate, it isn't a job, it's a passion. For some people, it is a job. And that's their right, and they can approach it that way. But for the most people, came to climate because it was passionate and we believed it was something good. And I guess the only encouragement I can give to myself and everybody else is that there's many, look at this building, right? There's many entry points if you were a Bond movie person to get into this building, right? So on the issues we're dealing with, you don't have to go through the front door always. But you just have to keep fighting, right? Because there's many entry points. And sometimes all we can do in any generation is crack the veneer. So I think that's part of what this conversation was about, to bring our story that we've experienced. And we didn't resolve it, but the point is most of these things are left open, and then we just chug along and compromise and say, okay, it's fine, we'll just do it that way anyway, because it's too hard to fight for something more. And sometimes the people that are fighting for one thing in the plan are not implementing it later on, to Penny's point about implementation. So sometimes there's no continuity. You know, and to keep the fire burning, you need to keep throwing logs at it. We've got enough logs, but we get tired of like putting the logs on the fire because we expect short-term gains. So, I mean, it was I think it was a lot of very emotional for me, actually, working on all of it. James, at a point in time, went into his investment banker mode, and, you know, and between him and Armando, there were lots of evil laughs. Penny was super uncomfortable about why did we choose to put her on the other end. But I mean, more than anybody I know, she fully appreciates both sides, you know, of the fence. So one other thing to just say before we fully close, with James's support as well, is that this was the first of a series of conversations we're hoping to have, and it would be great to hear from all of you, you know, how do we keep doing this, and because we want to work towards practical tools, especially for public and private sector, you know, around origination, due diligence, term sheets, terms and conditions, to make it real, so that we're not just sitting on a box and saying you should do this, this, and this, but to get very practical. It's been an honor to be on this moment with all of you, and also all of you to give us your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to bring this to a close. Thank you, not just to James, but to Georgie and Lucy and all the other people at GFI who have really helped make this happen. Please do get in contact if you want to be part of the conversation going forward. And yeah, I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.